Harvard's Patron, Jack of All Poets Areopagitica 2018 by Dr. Kevin Kiely. This book is about poets, poetry, and the vexed question of poetics, referencing Harvard's Woodbury Poetry Room and the patron, John L. Jack Sweeney 1906–86, Brooklyn-born Irish-American millionaire. He established the Woodbury Poetry Room within the college library and the university and endowed it with an international reputation. Henry James had instigated a stream of émigré writers and artists that stretched back as far as McNeill Whistler, and onwards into the 20th century, including Eliot, Pound, Stein, Hemingway, Merwin, Plath and others. Sweeney was neither émigré nor exile, and eventually quit the groves of academe for patronage outside of Harvard's walls. He was international, cosmopolitan with dual residence in America and various European hotels, luring many poets to visit his estate in the west of Ireland, including Eberhart, Cummings, Lowell and Frost. Sweeney was accepted in being a poet himself, known to hundreds of poets, and as patron in a bygone role because patronage is vital, necessary as when Maecenas was patron to Horace, Propertius and Virgil. He was a pioneer in gathering a vast constellation of 20th-century poets whose voices still echo in the Woodbury Poetry Room's sound recording archives, known as the Harvard Vocarium. The Poetry Room got its name from Edward Woodbury (1855–1930), poet, editor, and biographer of Edgar Allan Poe. Woodbury is the mascot of Harvard's patron, Jack of All Poets. Open any 20th-century anthology and the majority of poets included were friends of Sweeney's. His bohemian parties were the milieu of American poetry in Beacon Street, Boston. Sweeney didn't stack up poets into schools, movements, or inside canonically prescribed literature. He demanded curricula as expansive, unbounded, and free from academic collusion, publishers' cabals and literary cliques. Sweeney knew mainstream poets and others, off-the-beaten-track mavericks, outsiders, experimentalists, those involved in quarrels and institutional disputes, Lee Anderson with Yale, John Beecher suing San Francisco University. Arthur Gregor vociferous critic. Poet, Sid Corman challenging the establishment, real poetry versus academic poetry, counterfeit and classic. And poets each differing from the other, including Lawrence Lee, John Frederick Nims, Charles Philbrick, Raymond Rosaleep, William J. Smith, William Force Stead, and Robert Lax, whose Circus of the Sun ranks as perhaps the greatest language poem of the 20th century. All the poets wrote to Sweeney seeking patronage. Olson's thesis on Melville had been denied a Ph.D. from Harvard. Kiely reprimanded over an undergraduate indiscretion which Jack resolved between the poet and Harvard. Sweeney knew Harvard inside out, past and present. How Emerson got into trouble over a divinity lecture at Harvard. Longfellow, whose translations of Dante were forbidden when his proposal for free lectures at Harvard Chapel were summarily refused, but there were other debacles which Harvard's patron Jack of All Poets explores. Sweeney wanted to move towards resolution beyond conflicts between poets and the university, beyond committees and rules, through direct contact with real poets, real poetry, real literature. Sweeney's origins in poetry went beyond many poetic traditions, from freely associating with Dunbar's American Anthology 1787–1900, Alfred Krainberg's Lyric America 1930, to modernity, to the future. And of course to posit Jack Sweeney as arbiter, instigator and cultural yardstick of the Woodbury Poetry Room would be to superimpose on one individual and one university unsafe control over a vast span of literary history. Matheson's Anthology of American Verse 1950 influenced and informed the era developed by Alan Tate's and John Peel Bishop's American Harvest 1942, Oscar Williams's A Little Treasury of American Poetry 1948, and pushed towards Conrad Aiken's 20th Century American Poetry 1963 and Ezra Pound's Confucius to Cummings 1964. Further on came Donald Allen's The New American Poetry, 1945–1960, and Donald Hall's Contemporary American Poetry, 1972, showcased the postmodernists. Among Sweeney's contemporaries at Cambridge, England, were William Empson, Alistair Cook, Kathleen Raine, James Reeves, John Lehman, Jacob Bronowski, Malcolm Lowry, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, working on his Ph.D. that became the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Sweeney was discerning, while friendly with Larkin, Hughes, and Benjamin. It is more illuminating to find his tastes among Dylan Thomas, David Jones, Edwin Muir, Charles Tomlinson, and the outlawed poet, Christopher Logue. Robert Graves sought his advice along with John Wayne, Peter Redgrove, Peter Levi, and Michael Ireton. European poets, Yves Bonfoy, Pierre-Jean Jouve, George Seferis, Constantine Tripanis, St. John Perse, and of course, and Sweeney helped American poets in exile. He knew the A to Z list on American East Coast art scene. Anita Loos, the author of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, wanted him to edit her memoirs. Loos promoted Langston Hughes's poetry with Sweeney's patronage. Leon Adele, the Henry James biographer, found a patron in Sweeney while writing his voluminous biography. Henri Cartier-Bresson required cultural coaching on New York and William Burroughs' advice on his cutouts. Jack worked for free at Harvard, which is an act of patronage, as well as gifting personal funding to the Woodbury Poetry Room when seasonal budgets fell below the amount required to meet the costs incurred. This was an era of poets as well as critics including Cleanth Brooks's The Well-Wrought Urn. Ivor Winters, F. O. Matheson, Harry Levin, I. A. Richards. Politically charged poets from Edna St. Vincent Millay's Justice Denied in Massachusetts and onwards to Adrian Rich. There was much to criticize, not only war. Matthew Arnold's phrase "poetry as a criticism of life" was enlarged. Sweeney was uneasy in the academic world as male preserve, poetry as male preserve. Sweeney's poems were published in Poetry, Chicago, and 20th Century American Poetry, 1963, edited by Conrad Aiken, that flowed from Emily Dickinson to Anne Sexton. Jack Sweeney, waiting, gracious, white-haired, lovable, in the quiet sanctum of the poetry room, is one of many references in Sylvia Plath's journals. He helped Plath with delicate patronage towards the sole collection of her lifetime Colossus, 1960. Plath in letters to Sweeney shows professional control over private chaos. Sweeney enabled artistic friendships as cultural ambassador. T.S. Eliot wrote, "Dear Jack, thank you for your Phi Beta Kappa poem, An Arch for Janus. I liked the poem. I found it moving, especially, for some reason, the reference to John Quincy Adams." Sweeney, at an early read The Education of Henry Adams. Adams' ultimate education did not come from his ancestors' two American presidents, or his work as historian and professor, or his travels, but from the poet, Algernon Charles Swinburne (1837–1909), praised by the modernists, especially Aiken, Eliot, and Pound. Adams noted a meeting with Swinburne, long before the poet had ever published a collection of poetry. When Swinburne resided in Fryston House, Yorkshire, at last, if never before, Adams acquired education. Donald Hall, U.S. Poet Laureate, wrote, "Of all the people at Harvard associated with poetry, Jack was the least cluttered, the purest." Jack's passion for poetry extended beyond the modernists, the Black Mountain poets, the confessionalists to the Beats, the San Francisco Renaissance, the mainstream formalists, and the New York School, the latter Harvard men. Allen's New American Poetry presented more of Sweeney's poets, William Everson, Olson, Kiely, Ginsberg, Duncan, Dorn, Levertov, Rexroth and Zukofsky, as well as the New York poets, John Ashbery, Kenneth Koch and Frank O'Hara, who first met at Harvard where they were associated with the Poets Theater, and all three migrated to Manhattan. Allen included Corso, Ferlinghetti, Ginsberg, Snyder, Whalen, and in keeping with his avant-garde agenda, Jack Kerouac. Ginsberg's Howl pleads for those who were expelled from the academies for obscene odes on the windows of the skull. Windows of the Skull implies visionary, a hallmark of poetry for William Blake. Jack's respect for the adventure and shape-changing cultural movement of the Beats ensured he invited them to record at Harvard. Their forms of writing that thrived on the edge, that denied the authoritative in favor of the arbitrary and posited a random, unstructured world as well as an equally random, unstructured art. Bob Dylan's Desolation Row is informed by Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, fighting in the captain's tower, while calypso singers laugh at them, and fishermen hold flowers. Dylan's formation began when I read the poetry books, mostly Byron and Shelley and Longfellow and Poe. I memorized Poe's poem, The Bells, and strummed it to a melody on my guitar. Erich von Schmidt gave Dylan the song, Baby Let Me Follow You Down. I met him one day in the green pastures of Harvard University. The Woodbury Poetry Room signifies Jack's legendary associations with Aiken, Cummings, Eliot, Pound, MacLeish, Moore, Stevens, and formalists such as Robert Fitzgerald and Richard Wilbur. He knew Olson and Kiely, and within the manifestations of postmodernism, his scope reached to John Cage, Susan Howe, Clayton Eshelman, Michael McClure, David Antin, and up to the Who poet, Charles Bernstein's language revolution. Sweeney was living witness and patron to classic poetry but wanted to be wary of trammeled cannon's wheel ruts fixed in canonical steel from the Waste Land 1922, the Pisan Cantos 1948, the Auroras of Autumn 1950 through H.D.'s Helen in Egypt 1961, Rich's Snapshots of a Daughter-in-Law 1963, Lowell's For the Union Dead 1964, and as far as Berryman's The Dream Songs 1969, and Betwixt and Between to Rexroth's Selected Poems 1984, Carlos Williams's Patterson and Zhukovsky's A. Sweeney recognized poems as the autonomous productions of their authors, not written to please a patron or to honor a commission. Harvard's Patron, Jack of all poets, highlights poetry's progress from private utterance to each poem's destiny based on hitherto unpublished letters from the poets to their patron. Jack's actions as patron are Emersonian: when the public fails in its duty, private men must take its place. Jack too, like Emerson, saw the relinquishment of personal interest was necessary to achieve individuation and high levels of civilization. This death of the ego is part of the fabric of Jack's poem To Adams, an Arch for Janus. Emerson was banned from Harvard yet seemed like other delinquent poets to have been finally admitted, since the scholar and poet imperatively must be a university of knowledges at minimum. Harvard's Patron, Jack of all poets opens with a definitively non-academic introduction, and has an A to Z presenting the subversive scholarly, holographic, critical, biographical history of poetry based on vast resources, unraveling the poetics and the politics, triumphs and tragedies. Poets in breakdown and breakthrough, madness and suicide, agony, ecstasy, and comedy, and producing immortal poetry and literature which is free patronage to the university system. Available at Amazon Books, paper edition $20, Kindle and Kindle. Harvard's Patron, Jack of all poets by Kevin Kiely, Ph.D. www.kevinkiely.net. Kevin Kiely Poetwiki. Video production, Samurai text by Dr. Kevin Kiely. Copyright